James Abram Garfield, sworn in as president in March of 1881, died 6 months later. Did an assassin's bullet reduce what could have been America's greatest president to an historical footnote? This is the central question of Netflix's original series, Death by Lightning. Based on the incredible book Destiny of the Republic by Candice Millard, the series is the story of two men, one destined to become an assassinated president, the other his assassin. Death by Lightning is a fantastic adaptation of the book, but how well does it measure up to the real story? In my next series of videos, I'll be looking at the true story behind this incredible show, correcting some inaccuracies, and adding deeper context so you can understand the reality behind the drama. In this first video, I'll be focusing on episode 1 and how James A. Garfield, a congressman from Ohio with no intention of being president, was swept up in convention fever, accidentally becoming the Republican Party's nominee for president in 1880. Just how close did the series come to reality? Let's find out. And if you like what you see on this channel, I'd ask you to drop me a like and a comment. If you haven't subscribed yet to my channel, please do. I have some great videos on presidents like this one about the administration of Grover Cleveland. And with that out of the way, let's dive in. We first encounter James Garfield, played by Michael Shannon, chopping wood. Garfield did in fact own a piece of land in Mentor, Ohio, and actively worked his family farm. Born in a one-room log cabin and orphaned at an early age, Garfield grew up dirt poor, chopping wood and harvesting crops as a boy. In his teen years, he ran off to work as a boatman on the Erie Canal, but soon came to understand the value of education. He enrolled in Williams College, where he excelled as a student and paid for courses by working as a janitor. He eventually began teaching, becoming the school's most popular teacher, and later its youngest elected president. Moving to politics, he was elected to the state senate, a post he held briefly before the outbreak of the Civil War, when he enlisted and quickly rose to the rank of general. At the time we meet him in the series, Garfield has been serving his 17th year as a United States congressman. His life was the embodiment of the rags to riches American dream. Rutherford B. Hayes once remarked of him, "No man started so low and made it so far, not even Abraham Lincoln." While whipping up breakfast for his 7 kids, Garfield receives a letter from Washington, D.C. President Hayes has refused to seek a second term, and Treasury Secretary John Sherman wants Garfield to nominate him at the upcoming 1880 Republican Convention in Chicago. Garfield's wife, Lucretia, or Crete as her husband called her, appears worried that delivering a speech on behalf of Sherman could lead to something more, perhaps even her husband receiving the nomination for himself. The series accurately portrays Mrs. Garfield's worries, as well as Mr. Garfield's assurances that his nomination was highly unlikely. Throughout the real Garfield's career, he often expressed trepidation about becoming the President of the United States and deprecated his colleagues who vigorously sought the presidency as being victims of presidential fever. The series catches Garfield next as he arrives in Chicago. The city is accurately portrayed as a bustling metropolis. Much of this intrepid spirit for building and technological advancement rose from the ashes of the devastating Chicago fire of 1871, which nearly destroyed the entire city. The site of the convention, the state-of-the-art Industrial Exposition Building, perhaps more than anything, embodies this renewal. Garfield first stops in a hotel lobby for a brief meeting with Treasury Secretary John Sherman, whom he is to nominate at the convention. This scene is helpful in driving home a few key points about Garfield's character, including his reputation for being an incredible speechmaker and debater, as well as his heroic service during the Civil War. However, it is a complete fiction. Sherman was nowhere near Chicago during the convention, and was in Washington, D.C., following events from the telegraph office at the Treasury Department. In fact, despite what the series suggests, none of the candidates were physically present at the convention hall. Neither Ulysses Grant nor James G. Blaine, portrayed most Bradley Whitfordly by Bradley Whitford. Of course, I understand why the series chose, for the sake of clarity and dramatic effect, to have those figures be present at the convention. But the fact is that in those days, it was not common for candidates seeking the presidency to appear at the nominating convention, lest they seem too eager for the honor. In any case, I thought it was interesting that the fictional conversation between Sherman and Garfield included Sherman crediting Garfield with saving Tennessee during the Civil War. I could only think he was referring to Garfield's strategic military victory at the Battle of Whittle Creek, in which the young, completely inexperienced commander of the Ohio 42nd Regiment fooled a much larger Confederate regiment into retreating by dividing his flanks and giving the impression of overwhelming force. This battle solidified Garfield's early reputation as a bold leader. However, it was not instrumental in preserving for the Union the state of Tennessee, but the state of Kentucky. Not sure why Sherman says Tennessee here, but if I missed something, do let me know in the comments. Nevertheless, this scene is very helpful in explaining the division in the Republican Party at the time between the stalwart and half-breed factions. I'll be talking about this division a little bit later in the film. Congressman Garfield is later seen in his cramped hotel room outside of the convention. It is true that Garfield was forced to share his room and on one occasion even his bed with other convention goers. However, in the series, his roommate is an old vet who lost 2 of his sons in the Civil War. Garfield asks the man if he would fight for the Union again, knowing his sons were fated to die. The noble old man doesn't hesitate to say yes. This scene is useful in conveying to the audience Garfield's own inner turmoil about the war. On the one hand, he was radically committed to the cause of Union and the defeat of slavery, but on the other, he suffered deep traumas when he remembered the young men he sent into battle to die. In the series, the encounter with the elderly vet inspires Garfield to stay up all night and finish his nominating speech for Sherman. In reality, Garfield went to the convention floor on the day he was to nominate Sherman with absolutely nothing prepared and completely improvised his remarks. We next glimpse Garfield as he walks into the convention on nomination day, including a fantastic shot of Garfield and a bust of George Washington looking on very presidentially at the proceedings. Washington, too, took the presidency reluctantly only after his fellow countrymen insisted on it, so this provides a bit of foreshadowing. Garfield walks into the hall mostly ignored in the hustle and bustle of convention business. In reality, by this point, it is unlikely Garfield would be able to enter this space without drawing attention or even applause. The series, as well as Candice Millard's book, really tried to paint this picture of Garfield as a complete unknown, who before his nominating speech had no idea he could be nominated. Garfield had actually taken an active role in the convention in the first few days, and even settled a few contentious disputes. Because the Republicans had gone into the convention so deeply divided by factionalism, Garfield's leadership, including on the Convention Rules Committee, had by this point already provoked rumblings about his potential nomination. But that detail is left out, likely due to the fact that it detracts from the narrative that Garfield's nomination came like lightning from a clear blue sky. In any case, Garfield takes his seat quietly at the front of the stage as speakers for Sherman's competitors rise to nominate their candidates. First, we see Robert Ingersoll, who nominates James G. Blaine. The series adeptly, if not strictly accurately, portrays Ingersoll's lackluster speech, including the moment when he calls him James S. Blaine. At the real convention, this mistake was met with jeers from the crowd of, "It's James G. Blaine, you fool." In the series, Blaine himself, who again was not actually there, reacts by calling Ingersoll a twat. According to Wikipedia, this crude epithet was not in use in the English language until the 1930s. The next person to speak was, as the series correctly portrays, Roscoe Conkling. Roscoe Conkling was an influential and infamous senator from New York who was known as the leader of the stalwart faction of the Republican Party. This was a group of politicians who relied on the spoil system to amass incredible political influence and wealth. Stalwarts would get elected to high offices, disperse appointments to friends who would essentially bribe lower-level civil servants to line their pockets. Conkling was the king of this faction, and the fact that he was nominating former President Ulysses Grant to run for a third term to the presidency embodied the corruption associated with Grant. The actor Shea Whigham correctly plays Conkling as a rude, vindictive, frankly hateful man who never forgets a slight. The speech he gives in the series goes like this: "When asked from whence our candidate comes, we say Appomattox, and the crowd goes wild." Another source I found had it as, "When asked what state he hails from, our sole reply shall be, he comes from Appomattox and its famous apple tree." This line, of course, is a reference to Grant's service in the Civil War and his reception of Robert E. Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse, which effectively brought the Civil War to an end. All of this happened as the series portrays. However, at the real convention, Conkling actually gave a much longer speech, filled with invective and insults against other party members. His words provoked so many boos that at one point he stopped and sucked on a lemon while the audience quieted down. Conkling's speech arguably had just as much an influence on Grant ultimately losing the nomination as Garfield's speech had on him winning it. In the next scene, we see a fictional interaction between Roscoe Conkling and James Garfield in the bathroom. In the real story, there was no break between Conkling's speech and Garfield's. Garfield immediately took the stage to speak on behalf of Sherman. The speech is the center point of this episode. This scene, drawing heavily from Candice Millard's account of the events, hinges on the idea that Garfield, a complete unknown, turned the entire tide of the convention by the power of his own oratory. This, to a degree, is quite true, although, as we discussed earlier, there were already some rumblings about Garfield's nomination among convention delegates. Because the Republicans were so divided between stalwarts and their enemies known as the half-breeds, who wanted to end the spoils system and create a merit-based civil service system, many delegates were looking for a dark horse candidate to break a potential convention deadlock. Even before the convention, there was some buzz within Ohio for Garfield's candidacy, and Sherman actually asked Garfield to nominate him in part so that he wouldn't run against him. This, of course, turned out to be a grave miscalculation. In the series, Garfield begins with an elaborate ocean metaphor to describe division in the party, inviting a retort from Conkling, "I didn't know this was oceanography." While I found no evidence Conkling ever said this, he did later tell one reporter that Garfield's speech made him feel seasick. The rest of what Garfield says in the series contains pieces of Garfield's actual speech: a call to consider the needs of the voters, an appeal to the legacy of Lincoln, a reference to the defeat of the demon of slavery. Garfield is portrayed as radically ahead of his time on the issue of equality for African Americans, and this is hard to deny. This is not just an example of modern woke-washing. Garfield was in fact a vocal opponent of slavery and a supporter of full voting and citizenship rights for Black Americans. In the eyes of his contemporaries, radically so. As Garfield speaks, he is suddenly interrupted by a shout from the crowd. "We want Garfield!" This detail is consistent with Candice Millard's book. However, another book I read, President Garfield by C.W. Goodyear, does not document any such interruption during Garfield's speech. I imagine it must be hard to get the precise details correct on a 19th century political convention, considering most of the source material will be coming from journalists who wish to sensationalize events as much as possible. Still, Candice Millard's version makes for great drama, and frankly, I'm not too concerned with its veracity. In the following scenes, we see how Grant fails to amass the 379 votes required to clinch the nomination, and how a single vote for Garfield, on the first ballot in the film but on the third ballot in reality, balloons into his unanimous nomination as the party's standard-bearer for 1880. These scenes include a searing argument between Blaine and Conkling, which could not have happened in reality. Not only was Blaine not present at the convention, but Conkling had long refused to speak to Blaine after Blaine mocked Conkling's haughty disposition and turkey gobbler strut during a Senate speech 14 years earlier. Sherman also did not confront Garfield for disloyalty at the convention or ever, as far as we know. That scene is only meant to heighten the drama and highlight Garfield's conflicted feelings about being nominated instead of Sherman. A brief scene in which Garfield interrupts the convention chair to protest his nomination only to be told to sit down was almost word for word in line with what actually happened. One interesting detail you miss in the series is that the chairman was George F. Hoar, a senator from Massachusetts. Hoar was not the original choice for chairman because of his dislike for Ulysses Grant. Grant's 2 terms as America's 18th president saw a time of unprecedented corruption as the stalwart faction, embodied by men like Roscoe Conkling, dominated the party. Hoar had once said of Grant, "Selfish men and ambitious men got the ear of that simple and confiding president. They studied Grant as the shoemaker measures the foot of his customer." For this reason, Conkling tried to strong-arm the convention into picking a pro-Grant chairman, but it was James Garfield as head of the Rules Committee who intervened to ensure Hoar took the position instead. Hoar later admitted that when Garfield stood up to protest his own nomination, he told Garfield to sit down because he was hoping that Garfield would eventually become the candidate. And this brings up the question of how much of an idea did Garfield have that he could be nominated? According to C.W. Goodyear's book, President Garfield, although Garfield had some idea he might be nominated, when it actually started to look like it might happen, he turned pale and looked like he had been struck by lightning. When he finally received enough votes to be nominated on the 34th ballot, the chairman turned to Roscoe Conkling, asking the New York delegation to give over their votes to Garfield and make it unanimous. In the series, Conkling pronounces Garfield's nomination almost like a death sentence, which is a very Shakespearean twist for the sake of the series, but the accounts I read suggest he almost murmured these lines, filled with contempt for the final results. In another stroke of genius, the series films the moment of Garfield's nomination in a very similar way to his later assassination, even adding a boom sound like a gunshot. After all, Garfield's nomination did ultimately lead to his untimely death. As Garfield leaves the convention hall, in one last piece of fiction, he encounters an enthusiastic Charles Guiteau, his future assassin, who shakes his hand and tells him, "We expect great things from you." The truth is, this interaction could not have possibly happened due to the fact that Guiteau was hundreds of miles away in Boston on the night of the convention, but we'll get to that tale in a future episode about Guiteau. All in all, I think the first episode of the series is quite good. To anyone unfamiliar with the events surrounding James Garfield's surprise nomination at the 1880 Republican Convention, this is a great introduction. The chief deviations from fact, including the presence of many characters who weren't physically at the convention or in Chicago at the time, including James G. Blaine, John Sherman, Ulysses Grant, and of course, Charles Guiteau, help tell the story to viewers who would otherwise not be familiar with these events. And at the very least, one could argue that those figures were there in spirit. In the next episode, we'll deal with what I found to be a far more devious break with history, namely Nick Offerman's portrayal of Chester Arthur. Was he really the violent, drunken, puking thug the series makes him out to be? Hardly. So keep an eye out for my next video on that, coming soon to the One Human History channel. For now, this is Johnny from the One Human History channel signing off. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel for more great presidential content, and have a wonderful day.